The smoke still hung in the air like a funeral shroud when Kenji Matsumoto first saw the American soldiers walking through what remained of his village. It was September 1945, 3 weeks after the emperor's voice had crackled through radios across Japan, speaking words that shattered a nation's understanding of itself. The war was over. Japan had surrendered, and now the conquerors were here. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Kenji stood in the doorway of what had once been his family's rice shop, though now it was little more than 3 walls and a memory. At 32 years old, he had survived the war, but barely. His left hand was wrapped in dirty bandages. 2 fingers lost to an American bombing raid that had mistaken their village for a military installation. His wife, Yuki, had not been so fortunate. Neither had his 7-year-old daughter, Hannah. He watched the Americans approach with the empty eyes of a man who had nothing left to fear because he had nothing left to lose. They were tall, these foreign soldiers, with faces that seemed impossibly young and impossibly well-fed. Their uniforms were clean, their boots solid, their rifles slung over their shoulders with the casual confidence of victors. Behind them, more soldiers set up what looked like tables and crates near the village square, where the shrine to the emperor still stood, though someone had torn down the imperial flag. "They will kill us now," whispered old Mrs. Tanaka from her doorway across the street. She was 73, had lived through the Meiji Restoration, had seen Japan transform from an isolated island nation to an empire. Now she would see it humbled. "They will make us pay for what our armies did in China, in the Philippines, in all those places we heard about." Kenji said nothing. He had heard the stories too, the propaganda that had filled the newspapers and radio broadcasts for years. Americans were demons, they said. They would rape the women, torture the men, desecrate the sacred spaces. Better to die with honor than fall into their hands, the government had urged. Some families had done just that, choosing poison or the cliff's edge over capture. But Kenji was still here. He had not chosen the cliff. He had not chosen the poison. He had simply existed, day by day, in the ruins of everything he had known, eating grass and tree bark, watching children grow hollow-cheeked and silent, watching the elderly disappear one by one into that final sleep of starvation. The lead American soldier stopped in the center of the village. He was an officer, Kenji could tell, though he didn't understand the insignia. The man was perhaps 25, with brown hair and a strong jaw that was dusted with stubble. He said something in English, his voice carrying across the empty square, and another soldier beside him began speaking in halting, accented Japanese. "We are here to help," the translator said, and Kenji almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "We bring food and medical supplies. Please gather in the square. No one will be harmed." No one moved. Kenji could feel the fear radiating from every shadowed doorway, every broken window. There were perhaps 80 people left in the village, from a population that had once numbered 300. Most were women, children, and the elderly. The young men had been taken by the army years ago. Some had never returned. Some, like Kenji, had been sent home after injuries made them useless for fighting. The American officer spoke again, and the translator continued. "Please, we have rations, canned meat, rice, chocolate, medicine for the sick. We are not your enemies anymore. The war is over." Still, no one moved. The silence stretched out, broken only by the sound of wind moving through the skeletal remains of burnt houses and the distant cry of a crow. Then, from somewhere behind Kenji, he heard it, a child's cry. Not of fear, but of hunger. It was young Takashi, the 6-year-old son of the Yamamoto family. His mother had died 2 months ago, and his father was missing, probably dead in some forgotten battlefield in the Pacific. The boy was being cared for by his grandmother, who was herself barely surviving. The cry seemed to pierce something in the Americans. The officer turned to his men and barked an order. 3 soldiers moved to the crates and began opening them. The sound of metal on wood echoed through the square. Then Kenji saw it. Tins of food, bags of rice, boxes with red crosses on them. The officer himself picked up a can and a package wrapped in waxed paper. He walked slowly toward the houses, his hands held out, showing he was unarmed. He stopped in the middle of the road, knelt down, and placed the items on the ground. Then he backed away. For the child, the translator called out. For anyone who is hungry, please, take it. Minutes passed. The sun moved across the sky, indifferent to the drama below. Kenji found himself staring at the can on the ground. He could see writing on it, foreign letters he couldn't read. But he could imagine what was inside. Meat, perhaps. Real meat. Not the thin soup made from fish bones and hope that had been his only meal for days. It was Mrs. Tanaka who moved first. The old woman stepped out from her doorway, her back bent, her steps slow and uncertain. She walked toward the can like a person in a dream, waiting for the nightmare to begin, for the soldier to pull out a gun or laugh at her suffering. But the American just watched, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Tanaka reached the can and picked it up with shaking hands. She turned it over, examining it, then looked up at the soldier with tears streaming down her weathered face. She bowed deeply, her frail body folding in the traditional gesture of profound gratitude. The American soldier looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight, and said something in English that sounded gentle. That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment when the carefully constructed wall of fear began to crack. One by one, people emerged from their hiding places. First the desperate, then the curious, then the cautiously hopeful. Within minutes, 30 people had gathered in the square, keeping a respectful distance from the soldiers but no longer hiding. Kenji found his feet moving before his mind had made the decision. He walked toward the square, his bandaged hand held against his chest, his good hand empty and open. As he approached, he studied the American officer's face more carefully. The man had blue eyes, startlingly blue, like a summer sky that Kenji remembered from childhood, before the war had painted everything gray. Those eyes met his, and Kenji saw something he hadn't expected. Sadness. Not pity, but a deep, weary sadness that he recognized because he carried the same weight. Before the war, Kenji had been a different person. He had inherited his father's rice shop when he was 21, marrying Yuki a year later in a ceremony that the whole village had attended. They had been happy in the simple, unremarkable way that most people are happy. Their daughter Hannah had been born in 1938, a spring baby with her mother's gentle smile and her father's serious eyes. The shop had been small but prosperous. Kenji had taken pride in the quality of his rice, in the relationships he built with farmers and customers alike. Every morning, he would open the wooden shutters, sweep the entrance, and arrange the sacks and bins with careful attention. Yuki would prepare tea and handle the accounts, her graceful hands moving across the ledger with practiced efficiency. Hannah would play in the back room, creating elaborate stories with her dolls, her laughter a constant music in their lives. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now. That Kenji had died slowly over the course of 6 years, eroded by rationing and air raids and the casual cruelty of a government that demanded everything and gave nothing back. He remembered the day the military police had come, requisitioning 3/4 of his stock for the war effort. He remembered being unable to feed his own daughter while his rice fed soldiers he would never meet. He remembered the morning he had been conscripted, despite being older than most recruits. They needed bodies, they said, to defend the homeland. For 8 months, he had trained with antique rifles and bamboo spears, preparing to die gloriously in defense of an invasion that never came to their sector. Instead, the Americans had come by air, their B-29s painting the sky silver and dropping fire from heaven. The raid that took his hand had come at dawn. Kenji had been in the shop, preparing to open despite having almost nothing to sell. Yuki and Hannah were at home, just 3 houses away. He had heard the sirens and started running. He remembered the sound of the bombs, a whistle that grew louder, then the world exploding into noise and heat and chaos. He remembered being thrown through the air, landing hard against something unyielding. When he regained consciousness, his hand was a mangled mess of blood and bone, and the street was burning. It had taken him 45 minutes to dig through the rubble of his house. He found them together, Yuki's body curved around Hannah's, trying even in death to protect their daughter. They had been dead before he reached them, killed instantly by the blast. He remembered thinking, with a strange clarity, that at least they hadn't suffered. It was the only mercy in that moment, that they had simply ceased to exist, without pain, without fear, without the slow starvation that had become daily life for the survivors. The village doctor had amputated 2 of his fingers with nothing but sake for anesthesia and a leather strap to bite down on. Kenji had not screamed. He had not cried. He had simply endured, because endurance was the only skill left to him. Now, standing in the square as the American soldiers distributed their rations, Kenji found himself remembering something else. Something Yuki had said to him during one of their last conversations, before the rationing had become truly desperate. They had been lying in bed, listening to Hannah's soft breathing from across the room, and Yuki had whispered, "Do you think people in other countries love their children the way we do?" It had seemed like such a strange question at the time. "Of course they did," he had answered. "All people love their children." "Then how can there be wars?" she had asked. "How can we hurt each other this way?" He hadn't had an answer then. He didn't have one now. But he thought of her question as he watched a young American soldier, barely 18, with red hair and freckles, carefully measure out portions of rice into bowls borrowed from the village families. The soldier's hands were gentle, his expression earnest. He smiled at each person who approached, even though they couldn't understand each other's words. The translator moved through the crowd, explaining what each item was: canned beef, powdered milk, chocolate bars, real chocolate, dark and sweet, unlike anything they had tasted in years. Medical supplies, bandages, antiseptic, something called penicillin that could fight infections, blankets, soap, things so ordinary they had become precious. Kenji received a can of beef, a bag of rice, 2 chocolate bars, and a small package of tea. The soldier who handed them to him noticed his bandaged hand and said something in English. The translator appeared beside them. "He asks if you need medical attention," the translator said. "We have a doctor who can look at your hand." Kenji shook his head. "It is old," he said quietly. "Already healed." But the American officer, the one with the blue eyes, had overheard. He approached, and up close, Kenji could see the details that distance had hidden. The man had scars on his neck, small and stippled, like burns from hot metal. His left hand trembled slightly, though he tried to hide it. This was not a man untouched by war. Through the translator, the officer said, "My name is Captain James Morrison. We'll be stationed here for several weeks, helping to rebuild and distribute aid. I want you to know," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "that what happened here, the bombing, the deaths, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't change anything, but I'm sorry." Kenji stared at him. In all the propaganda, in all the stories of American demons and monsters, no one had ever suggested that the enemy might apologize, that they might feel regret, that they might carry their own scars and their own ghosts. "My wife and daughter died in the bombing," Kenji heard himself say. He hadn't planned to speak these words, hadn't spoken them aloud to anyone except in the formal prayers at their funeral. They were good people. They never hurt anyone. The translator's voice cracked slightly as he relayed the words to Captain Morrison. The American's face went pale, and for a moment, Kenji saw naked pain in those blue eyes. "I lost my brother in Okinawa," Morrison said, after a long silence. "He was 19, wanted to be a teacher." He looked around the destroyed village, at the hollow-cheeked children and the old people who had survived everything except hope. "There are no winners here. Just people who are still alive and people who aren't." Over the next 2 weeks, the Americans established a proper aid station in the village. They set up tents near the square, organized a distribution system for food and medicine, and began the slow process of rebuilding. Captain Morrison proved to be a man of his word. Supplies came regularly, and the soldiers treated the villagers with careful respect, as if they understood how fragile trust could be. But not everyone in the village was ready to accept help from the enemy. Hiroshi Saito, a former schoolteacher who had lost his son in the Philippines, refused to take any rations. He stood in his doorway each day as others lined up at the aid station, his face rigid with contempt. "They bomb our cities, kill our children, and now they want us to be grateful?" he said loudly one morning, his voice carrying across the square. This is shame. This is humiliation. Better to starve with dignity than eat the enemy's charity. Some people nodded in agreement, though most continued to accept the food. Hunger was a more powerful force than pride for those with children to feed. But Sato's words created a division in the community, a subtle tension that had not existed before. Kenji found himself in an uncomfortable middle ground. He took the rations because he needed them to survive, but he couldn't bring himself to feel gratitude. How could he be grateful to the people whose bombs had killed his family? Yet he also couldn't maintain the simple hatred that Saito embodied. The Americans he saw every day, Morrison, the young red-haired soldier whose name was apparently Tommy, the medic called Doc who treated injuries with gentle efficiency, they didn't seem like demons. They seemed like men who were tired of war and trying to do something decent in its aftermath. One afternoon, as Kenji waited in line for his ration, a commotion broke out near the front. Young Takashi, the orphaned 6-year-old, had collapsed. His grandmother screamed, and people rushed forward. Doc, the American medic, was there in seconds, kneeling beside the boy, checking his pulse, lifting his eyelids. Severe malnutrition, Doc said in English, and the translator relayed it. And probably dysentery. We need to get him to the medical tent now. 2 soldiers carefully lifted Takashi while his grandmother followed, weeping and praying. Kenji watched them disappear into the tent, and something in his chest, something he thought had died with Yuki and Hana, twisted painfully. He found himself walking toward the tent without consciously deciding to do so. Inside, Doc was setting up an intravenous drip, explaining through the translator what he was doing. Takashi lay on a cot, his small face gray, his breathing shallow. Will he live? Kenji asked. Doc looked up, his young face serious. I don't know. He's very weak. If we'd seen him a few days earlier. He didn't finish the sentence. Captain Morrison entered the tent, took in the scene, and immediately spoke to Doc in rapid English. Then he turned to the translator. We're going to move him to the field hospital in the city, Morrison said. They have better equipment there. We'll take his grandmother too, so she can be with him. That's 50 kilometers, the translator protested. The roads are barely passable. Then we make them passable, Morrison said firmly. We're not letting a child die when we have the means to save him. Within an hour, a jeep was loaded with supplies, and Takashi was carefully placed in the back with his grandmother, and document Kenji watched them drive away, raising dust on the damaged road, and felt something he couldn't name. Was it hope, or just the painful reawakening of emotions he had tried to bury? That evening, Saito confronted Morrison in the square. A small crowd gathered as the teacher spoke in rapid, angry Japanese. You think you can buy our forgiveness with your food and medicine? Saito demanded. You think we'll forget that you burned our cities? That you killed hundreds of thousands with your atomic bombs? My son died in Manila because of you. My country is destroyed because of you. And now you want us to bow and smile and be grateful. The translator looked nervous as he relayed the words, but Morrison listened calmly. When Saito finished, Morrison spoke quietly. You're right, he said, and the simplicity of the statement seemed to take the wind from Sato's anger. We can't buy forgiveness. Your son's death, your country's defeat, those are real, and nothing we do can change them. I can't speak for the entire war or the atomic bombs or the decisions made by generals and presidents. I can only speak for myself and my men. We're here because we were ordered to be here. We're distributing aid because it's the right thing to do. If you want to hate us, that's your right. But I won't apologize for trying to keep children from starving. Saito stood silent for a long moment, then turned and walked away. But Kenji noticed that his shoulders were shaking, and he realized the teacher was crying. The next morning, Kenji woke to find a small package outside his door. Inside was a new bandage for his hand, clean and white, and a note in careful Japanese. Your old bandage looked dirty. Infection kills. Please use this. Captain Morrison. It was such a small gesture, such an ordinary kindness. And yet Kenji found himself sitting on his doorstep with the bandage in his good hand. tears streaming down his face for the first time since he had buried his wife and daughter. 3 days later, the jeep returned. Takashi was alive. Still weak, but alive. Doc had managed to rehydrate him, treat his dysentery, and get proper nutrition into his small body. His grandmother wept with joy, bowing so deeply to the Americans that Morrison had to gently help her stand upright. "Please," Morrison said through the translator. "You don't have to bow. We're just glad he's better." But she bowed again anyway, and this time Kenji understood. It wasn't servility or defeat. It was the gratitude of a grandmother who had thought she would watch another child die and had been given a miracle instead. That night, for the first time in months, Kenji slept without nightmares. The transformation happened slowly, like winter giving way to spring. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but rather a gradual thawing of the frozen fear that had gripped the village. People began to speak to the American soldiers, at first through the translator, then in broken English as they learned simple phrases. Children, who adapted faster than adults, began to play near the aid station, fascinated by the strange foreigners with their unusual food and curious machines. Tommy, the red-haired soldier, seemed especially good with the children. He would perform simple magic tricks, pulling coins from behind ears, making small objects disappear and reappear. The children would laugh and clap, begging for more, and Tommy would grin and oblige, looking younger and more carefree than Kenji had yet seen him. One afternoon, Kenji watched as Tommy taught a group of children an American song, something about a farmer and a dog named Bingo. The children stumbled over the unfamiliar English words, giggling at their own mistakes, and Tommy patiently corrected them with exaggerated gestures that needed no translation. It was such a simple scene. A soldier and some children, singing under a damaged cherry tree, but it struck Kenji with unexpected force. This was what peace looked like. This was what happened when people stopped seeing each other as enemies and started seeing each other as simply human. Mrs. Tanaka began bringing vegetables from her garden to share with the soldiers. They were small, tough vegetables, grown in soil that had been corrupted by ash and debris, but she presented them with such dignity that Morrison accepted them with equal solemnity. In return, the Americans helped repair her roof and clear the debris from her yard. Even Saito softened, though he would never admit it. Kenji noticed him accepting rations when he thought no one was watching, and once saw him nod respectfully to Doc after the medic treated an infected cut on his arm. But it was a conversation between Kenji and Morrison that truly changed everything. It happened on a clear evening, almost a month after the Americans had arrived. Kenji was sitting outside his ruined shop, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Morrison approached and, through gestures, asked if he could sit. Kenji nodded. For a while they sat in silence. Then Morrison pulled out a worn photograph from his pocket and handed it to Kenji. It showed 2 young men in civilian clothes, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. They looked almost identical, brothers, clearly. "Daniel," Morrison said, pointing to the other man in the photo. "My little brother. He died at Okinawa. April 1945. Kenji studied the photo, seeing the joy and confidence in those young faces, knowing that one of them would never grow older than that frozen moment. "I'm sorry," Kenji said in halting English, words he had learned from the translator. Morrison nodded, his eyes distant. Then he said something longer, and when Kenji looked confused, he waited for the translator to catch up. "He wanted to be a teacher," Morrison explained. "Was going to go to college after the war. Loved kids, loved learning. I used to tease him about it. Said he'd never make any money as a teacher. He'd just laugh and say some things were more important than money." Morrison's voice cracked slightly. "The report said he was killed during the battle for Sugar Loaf Hill. I've thought about it every day since. Whether he was scared, whether it was quick, whether he knew how much we all loved him." Kenji found himself reaching into his own pocket. He pulled out a small photograph, creased and water-stained but still visible. It showed Yuki and Hannah, taken 2 years before they died. Yuki was smiling at the camera while Hannah, then 5, made a silly face. "My wife, Yuki," Kenji said. "My daughter, Hannah, died in bombing. March 1945. Morrison took the photo with careful hands, studying it with the attention it deserved. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. "I'm so sorry," he said. Then, in careful Japanese that he must have practiced, "They were beautiful. You must miss them very much." And there, in that moment, Kenji understood something profound. Morrison's brother and his family had died fighting each other, killed by the machinery of war that neither of them had truly controlled. But the grief was the same. The loss was the same. The hollow ache of missing someone who would never return. That was universal, crossing all boundaries of language and nationality and ideology. "War is stupid," Kenji said in English, using one of the phrases he had learned. Morrison laughed, though it was a sad sound. "Yes," he agreed. "War is very stupid." They sat together until the sun disappeared below the horizon and the first stars appeared. When they finally stood to leave, Morrison held out his hand, an American gesture of respect and friendship. Kenji hesitated only a moment before taking it with his good hand. The grip was firm and warm and somehow healing. The Americans stayed in the village for 6 more weeks, and in that time something remarkable happened. The village didn't just survive, it began to heal. Not just physically, though the Americans helped rebuild houses and clear rubble and establish a proper medical clinic. But emotionally, spiritually, in ways that were harder to measure but impossible to miss. Kenji found himself taking on an unofficial role as liaison between the villagers and the soldiers. His growing English, combined with his natural dignity and the respect he had earned through his losses, made him a bridge between two worlds that had been enemies. He helped translate not just words but intentions, explaining cultural misunderstandings and smoothing over awkward moments. When a young soldier accidentally desecrated a family shrine out of ignorance, Kenji explained the significance and helped the soldier make proper amends. When villagers were confused about American customs, Kenji explained what he had learned. Slowly, understanding replaced fear, and cooperation replaced suspicion. The aid station expanded into a true community center. The Americans brought in teachers to start classes for the children, ensuring they wouldn't lose more education than they already had. They brought in engineers to help restore the water system. They brought in agricultural advisors to help plan the next planting season. And they brought hope, that most precious and fragile of commodities, the one thing that had been in shortest supply even more than food. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. 3 months after the Americans first arrived, they prepared to leave. Their mission was complete, and they were being reassigned to help other communities. The night before their departure, Morrison organized a small ceremony in the square. Through the translator, he spoke to the assembled villagers. "When we first came here, I didn't know what to expect. I'd been told that you would hate us, that you'd see us as invaders and oppressors. And I wouldn't have blamed you if you had. But instead, you showed us grace. You showed us that even after everything, the war, the bombs, the occupation, people can still choose kindness. You've taught us that the end of fighting is just the beginning of peace, and that peace is something we build together, day by day, choice by choice." He paused, looking around at the faces that had become familiar over these months. "We're leaving tomorrow, but we're not abandoning you. Aid will continue to come. Reconstruction will continue, and we'll carry you with us. The memory of your resilience, your strength, your humanity. You've reminded us why we're glad the war is over, and why we must never let something like this happen again." Saito, standing at the back of the crowd, stepped forward. In a voice that carried across the square, he said, "I hated you when you came. I saw only the enemy, only the people who had destroyed my country and killed my son. But you have shown me that my son did not die at the hands of demons, but at the hands of men who were themselves victims of this war. That does not make his death easier, but it makes my hatred lighter. And for that, I thank you." It was perhaps the most difficult speech Saito had ever given, and the most important. Around him, villagers bowed in agreement. The next morning, as the trucks loaded up with equipment and supplies, the entire village turned out to see them off. Children gave the soldiers drawings they had made. Mrs. Tanaka presented Morrison with a carefully wrapped package of real tea, saved from before the war, her most precious possession. Morrison tried to refuse it, but she insisted. "For remembering," she said in careful English. "For not forgetting us." Kenji approached Morrison last. In his hand, he carried something wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it to reveal a small carved wooden figure. A crane, symbol of peace and longevity. He had made it himself with his one good hand, working late into the nights. "For your brother," Kenji said. "So his spirit knows peace." Morrison took the carving with trembling hands. For a moment he couldn't speak. Then he pulled Kenji into an embrace, another American gesture, but one that needed no translation. They stood like that for a long moment, two men who had lost everything and somehow found a way forward. As the trucks pulled away, raising dust in the autumn air, the villagers waved. And for the first time in years, Kenji felt something other than emptiness in his chest. It wasn't happiness exactly. The grief was still there, would always be there. But alongside it was something new. The knowledge that even in the aftermath of the worst that humans could do to each other, there was still room for the best of what humans could be. That evening, Kenji stood in front of the small shrine he had built for Yuki and Hana. He lit incense and spoke to them as he did every day, telling them about his day, about the Americans leaving, about the strange new world that was emerging from the ashes of the old. "I think you would have liked them," he said softly to the photographs on the altar. Morrison-san especially. He understood grief. He understood loss. And somehow that understanding made it easier to bear. The incense smoke rose in delicate spirals, carrying his prayers and his memories up into the darkening sky. Kenji stood there until the last light faded, then turned back toward his partially rebuilt home. Tomorrow he would open the shop again, not with much to sell yet, but with hope that there would be harvests to come, rice to distribute, customers to serve, a community to nurture. The war was over. The occupation had begun. And somewhere in between those two facts, Kenji Matsumoto had discovered that the enemy could become a friend, that hatred could transform into understanding, and that shared humanity was stronger than any propaganda or ideology. He had survived. Not just the war, but the aftermath. And in that survival, in that daily choice to keep living and keep connecting and keep building, there was its own kind of victory.